He made a generation laugh, but no one knew how much he was hurting. Behind Paul Lynde's campy one-liners and TV fame was a man battling addiction, loneliness, and a secret he was never allowed to share. Hollywood gave him a stage, but never let him be himself. This is the untold, heartbreaking story of a legend who died the way he lived off camera. Alone, misunderstood, and hiding behind a smile. A star with a secret. At first glance, Paul Lynde was everything Hollywood adored, unsharp, stylish, and wickedly funny. With his unforgettable voice and perfect comedic timing, he became a fixture of American television in the 60s and 70s. Millions knew him as the scene-stealing uncle in Bewitched, the sarcastic center square on Hollywood Squares, and the flamboyant father in Bye Bye Birdie. But what audiences didn't see, and what Paul never fully revealed, was the hidden side of his life. Beneath the laughs was a man living in fear of being exposed for who he really was. In an era when being gay in Hollywood meant career suicide, Paul Lynde lived behind a carefully crafted persona. It was a mask he wore well, but it came at a high emotional cost. His campy humor, often laced with double entendres and coded references, became a form of quiet rebellion, a way to express his identity without ever naming it. His zingers weren't just funny, they were a lifeline, a way to cope, to connect, and to stay relevant in a world that demanded silence from men like him. To the public, he was the lovable oddball, but off-screen, Paul was often isolated, misunderstood, and privately tormented by the weight of secrecy. Close friends say he longed for companionship, but didn't trust Hollywood, or even sometimes himself, enough to fully open up. In many ways, Paul Lynde was a star with two lives, the dazzling comedian adored by millions, and the lonely man in the mirror who never got to fully live as his authentic self. Fame's dark shadow. As Paul Lynde's fame soared, so too did the shadows that followed him. With every joke delivered, and every studio light that hit his face, the pressures of celebrity began to take a toll he could no longer ignore. Alcohol, once a social indulgence, became a constant companion. What many thought was part of his comic charm, the slurred sarcasm, the boisterous laughter, was in reality masking something far more painful. Behind the scenes, Lynde's drinking spiraled into addiction. Friends and colleagues noticed a change. The quick-witted comedian they adored could, with a few drinks, turn sharp and even vicious. The same tongue that dazzled audiences with one-liners began to wound the people closest to him. Longtime friends described him as unpredictable, especially when alcohol was involved, swinging between charm and cruelty in a matter of moments. Over the years, Paul's name began to appear in headlines for all the wrong reasons. Public intoxication, disruptive outbursts, and incidents that painted a portrait of a man unraveling under the spotlight he once craved. His brilliance on screen became overshadowed by whispers of his behavior off camera. But perhaps the most devastating chapter came in July 1965. Paul was staying at the Sir Francis Drake Hotel in San Francisco, accompanied by a close friend, 24-year-old aspiring actor James Bing Davidson. The two had spent the night drinking heavily, reportedly joking and horsing around in their hotel room. But laughter turned to horror when Davidson, in what was later ruled a tragic accident, fell from their 8th-floor window to his death. Though Paul was never charged with any wrongdoing, the emotional toll was immense. Those who knew him said he carried the guilt for the rest of his life. A heavy, invisible weight that deepened his sadness and likely intensified his dependence on alcohol. To the world, Paul Lynde remained the life of the party, a man who could make an entire country laugh. But behind closed doors, he was haunted by trauma, regret, and the slow realization that the fame he'd fought so hard for was doing little to fill the emptiness inside. A fall from grace. By the late 1970s, the cracks in Paul Lynde's carefully curated public image were no longer possible to ignore. The razor-sharp wit that once made him a darling of network television had begun to lose its shine, dulled by controversy, addiction, and the pain he never spoke about. His personal battles spilled into public view, no longer confined to whispers behind studio doors. Fans who once adored his every punchline now read disturbing headlines that told a different story. The fall from grace wasn't sudden. It was slow, bitter, and deeply public. In October of 1977, Lynde returned to his alma mater, Northwestern University, to serve as Grand Marshal for the homecoming parade. What should have been a celebratory homecoming. But that evening, after the parade, Lynde was involved in a deeply troubling incident at a local fast food restaurant. Witnesses, including a black professor named James P. Pitts, accused Lynde of making racist gestures and offensive remarks, behavior that stunned even those familiar with his erratic tendencies. Lynde, confronted with outrage and backlash, blamed the incident on fatigue and alcohol. But excuses couldn't undo the damage. It was more than just bad press, and it was a public reckoning, the kind Hollywood couldn't ignore anymore. Just months later, in January 1978, another incident further tarnished his already fragile image. While visiting Salt Lake City to film a segment for Donnie and Marie, Lynde's car was broken into. Instead of calmly reporting the incident, he allegedly confronted police officers with hostility, demanding they prioritize his case over an ongoing investigation. His erratic behavior led to his arrest for interfering with law enforcement. Though the charges were later dropped, the incident cemented his reputation as difficult, unpredictable, and deeply troubled. The roles began to dry up. The laughter grew more distant. Lynde, once a Hollywood staple, now found himself slowly pushed out of the spotlight. The industry that had once celebrated his eccentric brilliance was now quietly turning its back. What few realized at the time was that this wasn't simply a star in decline. It was a man unraveling, desperate to regain control, battling years of repression, loss, and unresolved trauma. And despite the walls he built around himself, in his homes, his jokes, his drinking, those walls were beginning to collapse, trying to turn it around. By the dawn of the 1980s, Paul Lynde had grown tired, not just from the relentless pace of Hollywood, but from the emotional wreckage left in his wake. Decades of hiding, drinking, and controversy had cost him friendships, roles, and perhaps most painfully, his sense of self. But for the first time in years, Paul began to fight his way back. Friends say he made a serious and sincere effort to change. He quit drinking. He began distancing himself from the destructive habits and people that had enabled his spiral. For a man whose public image had always masked private chaos, this wasn't just an act. It was real. And it was hard. According to those close to him, there was a noticeable difference. He was calmer, more thoughtful, even hopeful. He was starting to reconnect, not just with others, but with himself. His wit was still sharp, but there was less bite, less pain hidden beneath the punchlines. There were rumors that he was finally ready to embrace a quieter life. Not retirement, but renewal. He talked about getting back to the stage, about writing, even about finding peace away from the spotlight that had both built and broken him. But sadly, this fragile period of clarity wouldn't last. The years of emotional trauma, the damage to his body and spirit, couldn't be undone overnight. Paul Lynde may have been healing, but time was not on his side. A lonely goodbye. On January 10th, 1982, something felt off. Paul Lynde had been invited to a birthday party, the kind of social gathering he rarely missed. But that night, he didn't show up. No call, no explanation, just silence. To his close friend, actor, and model Paul Baresi, it was more than unusual. It was alarming. Baresi tried calling, no answer. The next day, concerned and uneasy, he returned to Lynde's Beverly Hills home with fellow actor Dean Dittman. They knocked, rang the bell, and called out his name. Nothing. Finally, Baresi made a difficult decision. He broke into the house through a side entrance. As soon as he stepped inside, the home's alarm went off. Piercing and loud. But that alarm would soon offer a chilling clue. It had been set from the inside, meaning Paul had locked up alone. No one had come or gone since. What Baresi found next confirmed the worst. Paul Lynde was lying in his bed, in his pajamas and robe. Still, silent, gone. He had died sometime in the night of a massive heart attack. He was just 55 years old. There were no signs of foul play, no drugs, no scandal. Just a quiet, solitary death, in a home once filled with laughter, wit, and a man who, for decades, hid his pain behind a dazzling showbiz mask. Tabloids rushed to sensationalize the moment, inventing stories of mysterious visitors or sordid final acts. But Baresi set the record straight. Paul wasn't found nude. There was no party, no drama, just a man who went to bed alone and never woke up. In life, Paul Lynde was a larger-than-life character. Flamboyant, funny, unforgettable. But in death, he slipped away unnoticed, leaving behind a mansion of memories and a legacy that was both joyful and deeply, deeply tragic. He brought laughter to millions, but in the end, no one was there to hear his final silence. The hidden life. To the world, Paul Lynde was the flamboyant comic genius with a razor-sharp tongue and perfect comedic timing. But off-screen, he carried a secret that defined, and often burdened, his entire adult life. Paul Lynde was a gay man in an industry and an era where coming out meant career suicide. In the 1960s and 70s, Hollywood may have winked at queerness behind closed doors, but it rarely allowed it into the spotlight. For someone like Lynde, whose very persona was laced with camp and coded innuendo, walking the line between visibility and silence was exhausting. In interviews, he sidestepped questions. In press features, his personal life was airbrushed out. Even a 1976 People magazine profile, one of the only mainstream articles to address his private world, never used the word gay. It merely described his live-in suite-mate and hairstylist, a man named Stan Finesmith. The implication was there, but the truth was buried beneath euphemisms. Friends say Paul never officially came out, not to the public, and not always even to those closest to him. He lived with the anxiety of being outed at any moment, constantly forced to perform a version of himself that felt safe for public consumption. The result was a deep and lasting loneliness. He surrounded himself with humor, with lavish homes, and with his beloved dog, Harry McAfee. But true emotional intimacy remained elusive. The love he may have longed for, the ability to walk hand in hand with someone openly, was a dream denied by the times he lived in. Longtime friend and biographer Kathy Rudolph once said, "Being gay and having to hide it frustrated him." It wasn't just secrecy, it was erasure. And the cost of that erasure played out not just in his personal life, but in the emotional volatility that often marked his later years. In the end, Paul Lynde's greatest role may not have been the sarcastic uncle, the center square, or the sitcom guest star. It was the role he played for decades off camera, pretending to be someone the world would accept at the cost of never fully being himself. The mansion behind the mask. Paul Lynde's fame brought him money, and with it the freedom to build a world entirely his own. Far from the stage lights and studio cameras, his homes became more than status symbols. They were his sanctuaries, carefully curated retreats where he could finally breathe. His first major acquisition was a Mediterranean-style villa in the Sunset Doheny area of Los Angeles, once owned by screen legend Errol Flynn. It was a glamorous, old Hollywood estate, full of romantic arches, lush gardens, and decades of whispered history. Lynde didn't just move in, but he transformed it. Working with famed architect John Elgin Wolfe, he redesigned the property to match his own flamboyant aesthetic. Dramatic, stylish, and refined. Inside those walls, Paul found beauty, control, and a space to express himself without censorship. No network notes, no critics, just chandeliers, velvet drapes, and carefully arranged quiet. The parties he hosted there were legendary, filled with stars, laughter, and behind it all, a man craving connection he rarely found. But it was his second home, perched high in the exclusive bird streets of Beverly Hills. That became his true castle. At 9250 Cordell Drive, Lynde built a Hollywood Regency masterpiece. Again enlisting Wolf, he shaped the estate into a dazzling expression of who he was. Bold, theatrical, unapologetically grand. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed sweeping views of Los Angeles. A trapezoidal pool and private gym added flair and function. Each room was a stage of its own, designed for drama and escape. He lived there not just in style, but in isolation. It was also in that very house, years later, that Paul Lynde would die. Alone in his bed, surrounded by the luxuries of a life he had built, but never fully enjoyed. These homes weren't just real estate. They were mirrors of his soul. Lavish, beautiful, full of personality, and ultimately, silent. The more successful Paul became, the more private he had to be, and the more private he became, the lonelier he felt. His mansions became masks, beautiful but suffocating. Legacy of laughter and loneliness. Paul Lynde may have died alone, but he did not die forgotten. His voice, his timing, his flamboyant flair, they live on in the echoes of classic television and in the memories of millions who grew up laughing with him, never knowing how much he was hurting behind the scenes. He was more than a comedian. He was a pioneer of coded representation, a man who, in an age of censorship and silence, managed to let his truth shine through the cracks. Every sly smirk, every sarcastic remark, every pointed pause. It meant something, especially to the viewers who saw themselves in him, even when they didn't have the words to say why. But his life is also a cautionary tale, a story of what happens when fame demands performance and the world punishes authenticity. Paul Lynde brought joy to others while denying it to himself. He was celebrated for his style, but rarely seen for his substance. Applauded on stage, but isolated when the curtain fell. In the end, he was a man split in two. The star America adored, and the soul Hollywood never truly made room for. After his death, Paul Lynde was cremated and returned home to Ohio. His ashes were buried in Amity Cemetery, beside his siblings and parents, far from the glitz of Beverly Hills and the quiet town where his story began. He may have spent a lifetime performing, but in the end, he returned to the only place that ever knew the real Paul Lynde. A small grave, a silent goodbye, and a legacy that still sparkles, with laughter, brilliance, and just a trace of sadness. He made us laugh. He made us think. And now, maybe, he finally makes us understand. Paul Lynde, A Life Behind the Laughter. Paul Lynde was a man of contradictions. Wildly funny, deeply private, adored by millions yet haunted by silence. His legacy is a reminder that behind the most dazzling smiles there can be hidden sorrow. He lived in a time that didn't allow him to be fully seen, and yet we saw him anyway. In every smirk, every raised eyebrow, every perfect punchline. He mattered. He still does. And maybe, just maybe, by telling his full story, not just the jokes, but the truth, we give him the kind of love and understanding he rarely received in life. Thank you for watching. What are your memories of Paul Lynde? Did he make you laugh growing up? Let us know in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give it a like, share it with someone who loves classic Hollywood, and don't forget to subscribe. There's always more behind the curtain, and we're here to pull it back. This has been another untold story from classic Hollywood. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember, every legend was once just a person trying to be understood.